Our story begins in the summer of the 5th year of King Hararo of Aachen, the same year in which the Treaty of Qumran was signed. After Hararo successfully defeated the final Bukharian raiders the year before, he had expanded Aachen's borders to here, giving the three major kingdoms of the region of Kalevala shared borders for the first time in their histories. In order to prevent the three kingdoms from constantly going to war, it was decided among the three rulers, Hararo of Aachen, Ulano of Orias, and Rega of Rus, to write up a peace treaty. This treaty, the Treaty of Qumran, clearly defined the borders between each kingdom and ensured a peace in the region. Unfortunately, the treaty had one fatal flaw. Since the only people at the treaty's drafting were the three rulers and a few scribes, the treaty ignored any nationalities or independencies that the previous peoples might have had. It simply granted Rus, Orias, and Aachen the territories that they themselves had gained or taken over. So cities like Duke or Pheromon would be given to their respective captors as opposed to being independent states. Remember that second one. It'll be important. For now, though, for the most part, the region prospered. The new peace made trade and commerce explode, which led to a boom in all three economies. There was the occasional rebellion from nationals every now and then, usually in Duke, but no revolt had the momentum to last more than a few months. For nearly 50 years, the peace lasted. A perfect balance. A happy medium. Unfortunately, there was one thing the original signers of the Treaty of Qumran did not take into account. A world without them. As time went on, the rulers who were at the original treaty signing died, and new monarchs took their place, with each generation becoming more and more wary of the others' loyalty to peace. In particular, the Kingdom of Aachen slowly began to solidify its position on the global stage. The kings, queens, and monarchs of Aachen became more and more tyrannical as paranoia set in, and extreme measures began to be taken. Each Aachen city was given its own military garrison, trade with other countries was halted, foreigners were not allowed inside Aachen's borders, and, for a few months, even the royal court was disbanded. All of these paranoid measures obviously took a toll on the Aachen people. Inflation and deflation of the economy was so rapid that the value of one Aachen mark would change within the week. The big one, though, the paranoid decision that would end up being the end of the Bora dynasty and the end of Aachen as a state, would be the execution of a woman named Weffa. The government claimed that she had been spreading ideas of revolution to different cities around Aachen, and was therefore a threat to the country. But in reality, no one knew who this woman was. She was just a commoner that the government was using to demonstrate its power over the people, and everybody knew. She was executed in the city of Pheromon on July 16th in the 3rd year of King Harada. At her execution, the onlookers booed and jeered, and when the axe fell, the Bora dynasty, the newly crowned King Harada, and the entire kingdom of Aachen fell with it. Weffa's execution was not the first nor last of its kind in Aachen. However, her murder had one major world-changing difference. At the execution was a small boy by the name of Valar. He was no one special, just a peasant there with his foster parents, but he watched the axe fall. His eyes absorbed the light coming off her severed head, and he became nearly traumatized by it. For the rest of his life, Valar would attribute this moment as the event that began his descent into revolution. 17 years later, Valar turned 23. Now able to understand the politics of the situation, he began to see the Aachen leaders as weak and paranoid, which, to be fair, they were. But even more than that, Valar had studied his city, Pheromon's, history, and saw the Aachen presence there as an occupying force. Valar wasn't happy that his former city-state was under the control of a paranoid, self-serving foreigner, and, like many Pheromon, he wanted the city to be its own independent state again, free of Aachen rule. So, in that same year, Valar joined the revolutionary movement called the Pheromon Opiliac, or New Pheromon. And in September of that year, the Pheromon Opiliac gathered their supporters and rioted. Unfortunately for them, the city's garrison was too well equipped, and the Pheromon Opiliac were quickly defeated and expelled from the city. The biggest loss for the revolutionaries in this skirmish, however, was that their leader, Akka of House Nelii, was killed. The group was now leaderless and living outside the city's walls. In a mode of desperation, Valar quickly organized the group and made an empowering speech that effectively crowned him the new leader of the Pheromon movement. After just 3 days, Valar had rallied and convinced the exiled peasants and common folk to launch an assault on not just the government building, but the entire city of Pheromon. They made some self-made ladders and makeshift weapons and a battering ram from the nearby forest trees, and launched their assault on the city. Valar knew that they wouldn't stand a chance against a readied garrison, so he decided to launch the attack at night. On September 23rd of the 17th year of King Harada of Aachen, Valar and the Pheromon launched their assault on the city. The victory was swift and surprisingly easy. Since their assault was at night, most of the guards were not awake, and the walls had minimal security. The Pheromon had the city of Pheromon under their complete control by sunrise, and Valar declared the official Kingdom of Pheromon. The Aachen quickly learned of this treachery, and were stunned at the incompetence of their garrison in the city. So King Harada quickly ordered his largest army to march southward and take back Pheromon. Valar caught wind of this news, and gathered his army of common folk and set out to meet them. The two armies met at the Suffix crossing across the Reeve River. The Pheromon force was much smaller, more inexperienced, and undersupplied, so the Aachen were feeling confident. Pheromon only had 3 units of peasant infantry and some stuffy armor and some spears, but they had also brought along 4 units of commoner archers and 2 catapult crews. Aachen, on the other hand, had only brought spearmen and cavalry. Despite having nearly double the size of the army, 931 troops to 536, it would be this indiversity that would be the Aachen's downfall. The two sides met on the battlefield with the Reeve River between them. The Suffix crossing was the only strip across the river that had water shallow enough for the armies to cross, so both sides knew that would be where the attack and defense would be. The only problem was that it was incredibly narrow. Valar, who was familiar with the region, knew this, and the Aachen, who were not familiar with the region, did not. Luck was not entirely on Valar's side, however. Unlike in his first battle to take the city of Pheromon, this time, Valar would not be on the offensive, and wouldn't get to choose when the battle started, meaning that he would have to utilize actual military strategy to achieve victory. And boy, did he. The Pheromon set up a bottleneck formation with the infantry in front and the archers and catapults on the sides and rear. The Aachen, on the other hand, decided that the strategy that had the best odds for them to win would be to simply throw all their troops at the enemy straight away, overrun their fairly weak peasant infantry, and crush their archers and artillery in the process. The battle commenced when the Aachen general commanded the entire infantry section of their force to cross the river double time. However, there was something that the Aachen general hadn't taken into account. The water may have been shallow enough to cross, but it was still knee-deep, and it slowed down the Aachen forces immensely. While they were slowed, the Pheromon archers and catapults fired volley after volley after volley at the Aachen infantry. Hundreds of troops were lost in the crossing alone, and those who did survive turned and started fleeing back to the Aachen side of the river, while the small amount of Aachen infantry who actually did make it to the other side were quickly sent running by the peasant infantry. Seeing that this wasn't going to work, the Aachen general sent his 5 entire cavalry units, including his own, across the river. Blowing his battle horn, he called for his fleeing infantry to join him, but only 2 units actually did. In short, the exact same thing happened. Even though most of the cavalry actually made it to the Pheromon side, they too could not break through the peasant infantry's line. The Aachen general was killed in the melee, and the remaining cavalry began to flee. Most of the Aachen troops in this battle were killed solely in the crossing stage, whether that be crossing to attack or crossing to retreat, but either way, it was this bottleneck strategy that helped Pheromon absolutely obliterate an Aachen force nearly twice its size. This battle not only put the Reeve River firmly in Pharamond hands, but would become a staple of Valar's military prowess and strategic genius. The battle over the River Reeve would become a household story of the peasant army that defeated one of the largest military forces in the world. With Achen's main army destroyed, all the Aachen cities were left vulnerable. Despite each having their own separate garrison and militias, there would be no way they could take on a proper army. And despite just being common people, that's exactly what Valar was turning them into. Valar recognized that now was the time to go on the offensive. He had his pick of any city in the northern region of Aachen, so he marched his army straight to one of the largest trading centers in the known world, the city of Tyrell. He took the smaller city of Helga along the way and put Tyrell under a siege. Valar understood that this next battle for the city of Tyrell would be crucial. If Pharamond won, it would sever Achen's main trading and economic artery. If Aachen won, then the Pharamond rebellion would run out of steam and would likely be pushed back all the way to their home city. But even more than that, Valar's own sense of honor and personal pride was on the line. He had proved he could fight defensively. Now he had the chance to show that he could fight offensively. And if he could do that, then he might, just might, give King Harada enough reason to sue for peace. And as it would turn out, Valar's offensive strategy was just as ingenious as his defensive one. The battle began when Valar ordered his catapults to take out the archer towers and knock a hole in the Aachen wall. And he created this gap with a very specific strategic intention. It opened straight into the main street of Tyrell. The Aachen troops had time to take their own defensive positions first. The Aachen spearmen and infantry set themselves up on either side of the gap as to not leave them exposed to archer fire, yet also ready to pounce on any infantry that tried to breach the gap. Now normally, this would be seen as a disadvantage, but it ended up playing right into Valar's hands. By splitting their garrison into two, the Aachen unintentionally left a gap between their forces and gave the Pharamond army a path straight down the city's main road. Valar's general's bodyguard cavalry unit rode directly through that gap and into the main street. The Pharamond infantry did the same and split the Aachen army into two, and with a larger force, Valar and Pharamond came out victorious, with not even a third of the casualties that they had caused the Aachen force. The Aachen general had broken rule number 1 of military strategy: never split your force into two, and they had paid for it with an entire city. Back in the capital of Aachen, the city of Aachen itself, King Harada was in a panic. He had just lost 3 cities and 2 major battles to a peasant army in less than 6 weeks, and he was bizarred by the fact that this simple man, Valar, was turning out to be a better military strategist than many of his own generals. He had received multiple ultimatums from Valar asking him to sue for peace, but Harada was having none of it. Harada wanted this rebellion ended. Fast. So he called a roundtable of his 5 best generals, 3 of which were his 3 sons, at the capital and made a plan to once and for all put down this rebellion. And this is how they were going to do it. Everyone at the round table knew that Tyrell was one of the largest trading centers in the world, which meant that it required other cities and other countries to trade with it in order for it to survive. Cut off its trade, and the city will collapse. The final plan went something like this. The 2 generals and 3 princes would build up 5 separate armies from their respective cities, of which they were the governors. The 3 princes would then combine their armies into one giant force and siege Tyrell. The remaining 2 generals would combine their 2 forces and position themselves on the Reeve River, so no Pharamond forces could come in and break the siege. With Tyrell's supply line entirely cut off, there would be no way the Pharamond forces could survive for more than a month, and they would be forced to surrender. And to make things even better, winter was about to set in. Over the next 2 weeks, the 5 generals went to their cities and gathered their forces. They individually gathered nearly 450 soldiers from each of their respective cities, with the prince's combined army counting nearly 1,350 troops total, while the other 2 generals' combined army counted just above 900. The two combined forces headed straight for their positions, and the princes launched their siege. Now it was a waiting game. A month passed. 2 months passed. 3 months passed. And finally, on the first day of the 4th month, Valar sent a letter out to the princes saying that he wanted to negotiate for surrender. The princes were pleased by this notion and told Valar to meet them outside the city in a tent. Valar did so, and the parties agreed to surrender terms. The Faramon army would disband and not cause the Kingdom of Aachen any more trouble. The city of Faramon was to come under Aachen control once again, and any other attempt at rebellion would be considered treason. In exchange, Valar would be allowed to defend his actions in court, as opposed to being executed then and there, and no former Faramon soldiers would be tried for treason. It should be noted that it is heavily debated whether or not the princes and Harada would have actually heeded these terms, but that's a story for another time. Valar agreed to these terms and led the Aachen army inside Tyrell. As the Aachen army marched through the gates and into the city, they were quickly surprised by archer and artillery fire. The 3 princes who were at the head of the massive queue were each shot off their horses dead. The rest of the Aachen army, who was still outside the city, was a bit confused at first, but quickly recognized what was happening. Valar only let them into the city because he knew they'd be unorganized and unprepared for an attack. Valar himself quickly escaped through the lines of his own troops, while arrows and balls of fire continued to rain on the Aachen troops who had entered the city. Some of the Aachen troops turned to fight the enemy. However, what they saw this time was not a bunch of unruly peasants trying to fit into battle armor. What they saw were soldiers, trained troops who were ready to fight and die for what they believed in. Valar had used the 3 months he spent under siege to train up his forces and transform them from everyday common people into specially trained soldiers. Valar now had a proper army on his hands, and it would be the same bottleneck formation that killed another Aachen army. Despite not losing too many soldiers in the actual battle itself, the Aachen troops were spooked and fled the scene. They had just lost all 3 of the heirs to the Aachen throne in one solitary archer volley, and they were supposed to charge headfirst into a city defended by one of the best military strategists of the time? No. So the Aachen troops fled while being cut down by the newly created Faramon cavalry. Upon hearing the news of defeat, the other 2 generals sent by King Harada to the Reeve River made an attempt to engage the Faramon forces, but that battle was such a great defeat that it left no Aachen survivors to tell about it. Perhaps the most confusing thing about this entire sequence of events was how Valar managed to survive a 3-month-long siege with only 1 month of supplies and food rations. This problem gained so much fame that it became the life's work of many mathematicians, philosophers, and even accountants and merchants all around Kalevala, and would later be dubbed the Valarian problem by the Dukic mathematician Nolapar.